What happened? Well, here we are, guys. We are at the end of our Lords of Shadow trilogy retrospective. This is the final part, and wow, what a wild ride it has been. Being able to play these games for myself has certainly been a worthwhile time. And though I've got my issues with each of these titles, I think there's plenty of good stuff to be found too. And judging by the response to those videos both here and elsewhere, I don't think I'm alone in feeling that way. Maybe there are some out there who hate or love these games a lot more than me though, so maybe I'm some kind of mediator for this bizarre settlement case. Lords of Shadow was a mixed experience by the end, but I really did enjoy the storyline and the way it twisted some of Castlevania's key conventions, telling the story of the savior of the world and the beginning of the illustrious Belmont bloodline and warping it by taking Gabriel down the path of darkness, despair, betrayal, and loneliness, becoming the very thing he swore to destroy in the end as Dracula, Prince of Darkness. An ending twist that, as I said before, is an absolutely ludicrous way to end your game without any real decisive build-up to that moment. But it's something that threw a spanner in the works for how we'd expect this trilogy to go. I don't think anyone really expected that twist to happen once they got to the end of Lords of Shadow. Granted, just because you don't see a twist coming does not automatically make that twist inherently interesting. In this case though, it worked for me, and I was very excited to see what would come out of it on the other side. Cue Mirror of Fate, an introspective look into Gabriel's son and grandson Trevor and Simon Belmont, and their journey into Castlevania to put an end to their dear old vampiric relative, dealing with lineage, cursed fate, love and loss, and above all else, family ties. And it's those familial roots that tie this whole trilogy together. Everything is done for the love of a beloved, a mother, real probably a little British slang there, a son, the future, and the past, to forge new connections and keep old ones from withering and dying. If the classic Belmont lineage from the original series was simply tied by blood, this one is joined in a never-ending barrage of pain and anguish, with some never knowing the truth of their own ancestral history. It's one of the main things that makes Lords of Shadow stand out to me. These aren't heroic stories of bravery where we defeat the darkness and go home. These first two games are about how things are never so simple, how our paths can so easily twist and change and turn us away from the people we once thought we were, how a Belmont can turn into the very villain that spurs all of this on in the first place. Lords of Shadow manages to weave these ideas into its storylines pretty well for me, even though I think they should have had even more of it than they already did. A big issue with these games is when they leave the opportunities for deeper characterization rotting in the fruit bowl. And if someone isn't really buying into these concepts already, I can imagine them walking away from these games feeling really unsatisfied. I grew up playing Zelda games though, so I love when games don't really devote much time to the main character speaking. I'm used to reading between the lines, but sometimes you do need characters to do a little more to get the whole point across. Gabriel just doesn't really have enough moments in Lords of Shadow to really endear you to him, a problem mostly solved by the time Mercury Steam got to the DLC. And Mirror of Fate was actually really good in this regard. Plenty of time was dedicated to the characters having good interactions and playing off of each other pretty nicely. And now, since it was a 3DS game, there were obviously limitations as to what they could have done, and they insisted that every story sequence was a fully 3D cutscene with spoken dialogue. Looking back, I wonder if some scenes could have been purely text in text boxes just to add some more meat to those bones. But these are big filmic experiences at the end of the day, and they've got big time actors in them, so I guess we need to make that work. And elsewhere, you know, I've been mixed on the gameplay. Again, there's good ideas in the combat, but the game feel was never quite there for me, and both of the first two games they left something to be desired. Mirror of Fate was a big step up though in this regard, taking some of the vague doughiness out of Lords of Shadow and giving it a slightly snappier feeling. But that now brings us to Lords of Shadow 2, and I'll be honest, this is the game I have been waiting to play all this time. Ever since I started up Lords of Shadow in October, all I could think about was getting to Lords of Shadow 2. A game so hotly mixed on the internet from the moment I even knew it existed. Back in the day, I remember magazines saying how it was a distinct step down from Lords of Shadow, and it lacked something, and that was backed up by everyone that I saw online playing it themselves. But I am nothing if not someone who thrives off of these sorts of experiences. A 7 out of 10 game to everyone else always has the potential to be the greatest thing I've ever played. That's right? I think Assassin's Creed 3 is the best game in that series. But the same thing happened with The Bouncer, Dirge Cerberus. Just ignore the video that's up there right now, I'll make a new one soon. And even the PS2 Castlevanias, which I know are far from reviled in the community, but they also aren't typically beloved like other Vanias. All of these experiences are ones that I genuinely love because through all the stuff that is obviously not amazing, there is stuff that shines through too. So all Lords of Shadow 2 has to do to win me over is double down on that storytelling that made it worth going through those first 2 games. I'm not expecting this game to change my life, and I don't want it to. All I want it to be is as big of an improvement Mirror of Fate was to Lords of Shadow, and I don't think I'm really asking for much. So if there is anyone out there that is looking to love Lords of Shadow 2, it's undoubtedly me. So did I love Lords of Shadow 2? So where Mirror of Fate left us, we had just defeated Dracula with Alucard and Simon Belmont working together to bring him down. We then saw one last scene of Alucard finding a piece of the vampire killer before flapping his little wings into the wilds. It was sort of a cliffhanger, I guess, because there was no real indication of what could happen next. Lords of Shadow 2 does not begin around this point or even where the post-credits scene of the first game left us. Instead, we join Dracula sitting on his throne at his castle as it is attacked by the Brotherhood of Light. Cue a tutorial, a big titan fight, a cool boss fight, and the tease of a reunion between Dracula and Alucard, indicating that this takes place a good bit after Mirror of Fate. Then we get thrust into the body of the old and withered Dracula from that post-credit scene, and I absolutely love that we actually get to control Gabriel in this form. We can see how weak he was in that cutscene before, but to actually play it is another thing altogether. It's like the one time a slow walk sequence is permissible, and it works after having an opening where we have access to all of our soon reacquired abilities. It also clues us into the reality of an existence like this. Sure, Gabriel is immortal, but at what cost? This is no way to live for an eternity. It's an extremely vulnerable way to kickstart this journey and is exactly what I'm looking for. Pushing us out into the modern world is also such a cool added wrinkle to this point in the storyline. We're away from Gabriel's time and into a place he shouldn't really be familiar with at all. Like a fish out of water or a bat out of a cave? Yeah, this little section culminates in Gabriel getting surprised by a creature and getting absolutely bodied in the fight before he gets a little helping hand. And afterward, he gets lucky and feeds on a whole family that's locked in a room with him. Yeah, this is a pretty messed up thing to do, but hey, it's what had to be done, you know? There definitely wasn't some other kind of morally bankrupt person in this entire city that we could have drained on to get our power back. No, it had to be this incredibly innocent family. This completely necessary sacrifice gives Dracula his youth back like he marinated in anti-aging cream for a day, and we reunite with Zobek and his henchmen with the cross-dimensional sword. Oh yeah, he's cool. Yeah, he's cool. I like him. We get reminded of Satan being a little upset about Gabriel stomping him before, and Dracula's weakened position has finally given Satan the chance to rule over the mortal world. So Zobek hatches a plan. We find Satan's 4 acolytes and kill him. We'll be able to get one over on the big boy and take him down once and for all. This starts the uneasy alliance between the two, and it's a fun dynamic. At this point in the story, Zobek is now a wealthy businessman, and I guess no one really cares that he never seems to die in his old age. But hey, that goes for most politicians these days, am I right? Get those fucking guys out of here already. It's at this point that the revelation that this city is built on the ruins of Dracula's castle. This place is Castlevania City, and that is just cool as hell. As such, you can see remnants of the castle throughout the world, either through the neo-Gothic architecture of the city itself or the literal remnants of the very stones that made up the castle from before. What an absolutely beautiful way to evolve the setting of Lords of Shadow while still keeping it intrinsically tied to Castlevania itself. It really does enhance the connection that the setting has to Gabriel, who is trapped in a never-ending loop in this place for the remainder of his immortal existence. And I'm gonna commend Mercury Steam again because they floor me with their environmental design. This city is absolutely breathtaking in certain spots, and while nothing quite gives me the same melancholic feeling that some of the shots in Lords of Shadow 1 did, I still think this place looks incredible. But this is also where one of Lords of Shadow 2's weaknesses pop up. This game forgoes the fixed camera angles for a fully movable 3D camera instead, and that's great for the game feel, sure, but it's undeniable that some of the artistry goes out the window too. I really miss the variety of shots that Mercury's team was able to pull off before. You get nothing here like the shots in the first game as you walk along a gigantic chain of the castle, or overlooking the cliff on the ocean, or seeing the camera pull out as you see how tiny Gabriel is in relation to the world around him, but it worked there for the grandiose that the first game wanted to get across. So let's think about how this new camera makes the adventure feel. For starters, we are now right alongside Gabriel for 90% of the adventure. Sometimes the camera will move out to give us a different look at an area temporarily, but for the most part we are glued to this perspective. And that puts us right next to Gabriel physically and tethers the player to him so much more. We get to see the scale of the world more so from his perspective. Towering skyscrapers reach up to the stars. Stage hazards are much more hazardous in appearance because the lava is right there! And darker locations are made more effective because of this more subjective angle. Also, since Dracula is a vampire this time, we only get to explore the game at nighttime, which does cut the potential variety of the setting by half. And since lighting was such a strong point of Lords of Shadow, pulling out the biggest light in our solar system does have a negative impact all around. It would have been neat if Zobek MacGuffined a spell to make Gabriel immune to sunlight for a time, just so we could get to see the city at different times of day, but oh well. We still get plenty of cool nighttime visuals, but you know, it's still missing something. It's missing something for me. Setting your game at nighttime isn't automatically a cue to make the world feel this dull and monochromatic. Let's be honest. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines proved this in 2004 by having a game set entirely at night be a truly vibrant adventure, overdosing on neon bliss, crimson nightclubs, and the hazy glow of streetlights to brighten the experience. And when you compare that to this, it's obvious that Lords of Shadow 2 is missing something. This adventure may benefit from this drab aesthetic overall, but I don't know, that really comes down to personal taste. In my eyes, the absence of visual variety doesn't always lend itself to a deeper overall mood. Crushing down the palette to mostly consist of blacks, grays, and pale greens and blues, it doesn't do much for me ultimately. Not in the way it's presented here at least. Hell, even Mirror of Fate had a ton more visual variety than this. And it's a shame that Lords of Shadow 2 doesn't really quite match up to either of the first two games. So I'm less of a fan of this whole approach, but it's undeniable that it achieves a different feeling entirely. And that works for the kind of adventure this is. Lords of Shadow 2 is an introspective look at what it means to be Gabriel at this point in his life, his role as Dracula, and the internal conflict that is warring inside him. So much of this game is devoted to questioning who Dracula really is at this point. Is he really this wholly evil creature, unfeeling, unwilling to look into the light, someone who has foregone his family and lineage? Or is that something more there? Is Gabriel still in there somewhere, or has something new entirely taken root within him? It's what the ending point of Mirror of Fate signals to us, that deep within him is still the love for his immediate family and the regret that he never got to truly meet his son. This brings us to the second major location of Lords of Shadow 2, which is Dracula's castle as it originally was hundreds of years ago. The home that Gabriel found himself trapped within. It's unclear what this place really is though. Is Gabriel here mentally, spiritually? Is this a real place that borders on reality? When the castle crumbles apart, is it actually still somewhere in this world, lingering in stasis in these icy mountains? This place isn't really treated like a home for Gabriel though. It's actually more of a nightmare as the souls and demons of the castle, made from his blood, call to Gabriel and try to trap him there during this journey. And it's only the light of his son Trevor, shown as a boy, that keeps Gabriel tethered to something. He never got the chance to know Trevor as a boy, and that regret is written all over Gabriel's face in these scenes, but he also makes a promise to keep him safe in this castle of horrors. Gabriel has to protect Trevor from the demons of his own creation, and that's such a brilliant way to illustrate the constant conflict raging inside him. So these are the two settings for the adventure. Modern day Castlevania City, where we are hunting for Satan's acolytes, and the metropolis being slowly ravaged by demons and a plague, and the nightmare of the original castle that Dracula has to navigate carefully to protect his son. On the one hand, we've got Dracula finishing off a fight that Gabriel started all those years ago, and on the other hand, we've got a conflict that only Gabriel deep within can conquer. And goddamn, this is such a cool setup for this game. It's such a clever and thematically appropriate direction to take the storyline. And I was so excited to find out that this was the framework going forward. I think that Mercury's team has always been pretty good at twisting these scenarios to work well for characterization. They did it for Lords of Shadow and Mirror of Fate, and the setup for this game is very good too. But sometimes, as with those last two games, there's some stumbles with the execution here that drags Lords of Shadow 2 down so much more, to the point that I've got a lot less nice stuff to say about it than I wish I did. The first thing to take note of in Lords of Shadow 2 is that things really aren't that different to the first game in terms of its moment-to-moment gameplay. You walk along a straight path or engage in some platforming before entering a combat room and needing to clear the area before you progress. The key difference is that this game isn't structured via missions that take you to a different stage upon completion. Instead, Lords of Shadow 2 goes for a single connected world that has you working through it and taking different paths around it during the storyline. This is sort of how it worked in Mirror of Fate, but each act of that game took you to distinctly different parts of the castle. In Lords of Shadow 2, you'll be going to different districts of the city and will often have to backtrack through areas you've already been to in order to get to progression. As for how they make backtracking more interesting, you'll run into situations where you'll clearly need a double jump or something and realize you'll probably come back through here later on. Classic Igavania shit in concept, but we're still only backtracking for health and magic capacity upgrades, and I'll be honest with you, you will not see me going out of my way to pick those up. They're not that exciting. Elsewhere, we are still picking up scrolls and notes to give us some extra lore and context for the world that surrounds us, which is way more interesting this time given that it's modern day and so much has happened in the time that Dracula was inactive. The notes in the city clue us into how the world developed and prospered after Dracula's supposed defeat, while the notes in the castle usually speak of how warriors failed to best the horrors within. Look, it's nice to see that some of those classic ingredients remain, but I have to say, this all still feels just a little bit weird. Structurally, I can say that I missed the way Lords of Shadow did things. I think having a long line of missions laid out before me was daunting, but looking back, it was nice to know that each stage would offer something different. Because that game never really recycled stages later on. All 50 or so of those missions were pretty unique, at least in terms of their, broad features. Here's a cliff, then a forest, then an old monastery. In Lords of Shadow 2, we got science labs, dark alleys, and I guess old monasteries, yeah. This kind of feeds into my previous complaint about not liking the visuals as much in this game as I did in the first, because everything looks so bland. It's hard to feel like you're going to distinct areas and not just alley number 3. The only way to tell where you are half the time is this little caption under the minimap that lets you know if you're in a specific district. But even then, I'll be honest, I just followed the objective mark to take me where I needed to go. I really don't get what the ideas behind this game's structure was, because I expected a lot of lessons to be learned from Mirror of Fate about what makes a Castlevania map interesting. Lots of platforming, the occasional fun boss fights, and items hidden away only acquirable through new abilities. For the vast majority of Lords of Shadow 2, you aren't really thinking about any of this though. And I assume it's because when you beat the game, you get plopped back out onto the city streets to do some cleanup. Enjoy a post-game experience that feels more like you're stuck in limbo, and I don't mean the fun one from this game. You don't even get the double jump until pretty close to the final section of the game, so you don't have much of a kit to mess around with for most of the runtime. It's at this point that I got a little worried, because this game's structure is by far the weakest of the 3 Lords of Shadow games. With that being said, there's still some stuff to work with here. Mistform makes a return and lets Gabriel pass through gates and gratings with ease, and you even get some very light platforming puzzles where you need to enter the Mistform on these fans to get propelled upwards or sideways. There's never much thought needed for these though, and the Mistform itself is painfully slow. But as far as cool movement tech goes, that's about it. There's the Mistform, which is only used in specific instances, and the double jump you get at the end of the game. That's it. There's no grappling hook this time either. No sprint boots, though technically there is a sprint by pushing the analog stick twice in the same direction, just like before, and yeah, that never got fixed. That input still sucks, and I can't find a clip of sprinting because it's hardly noticeable. There basically is no boost of speed. It's kind of pointless. I don't know why it's in the game. There's no air dashing, and there's no gliding either. Gabriel still gets to scale walls, and this is actually a massive improvement because it's so much faster now, which is great, but that's all we've got for movement. There's basically nothing dramatically new or interesting to talk about, so we're just gonna move on. Right, let's try this. Stealth sections aren't that bad, really. I don't think the stealth parts of this game ruin it entirely, because they really aren't that bad. They're more like puzzles anyway, but they're so average that I have have to wonder what the point of them really is. Because Dracula is weakened in this game, he can't take on these guys with the big guns because they'll two-shot him instantly. So he has to take a different approach and get past these enemies in cunning ways. Now in these sections, you usually get to turn into a rat and sneak around the areas a little bit and access little tunnels. You also get to possess enemies and take them over to retinal scanners to open up the exit to the room. Other times, you can just distract the guards with a bat swarm to make them look the other way while you scamper off. Those are the 3 solutions to every stealth segment for the most part. Rat, possess, distract. That's all you have to do to get past these guys. And I like the idea of a stealth section in a vampire game. Vampires are all about subterfuge and working in the darkness. They have to use secrecy to get their way most of the time, and it's an even more interesting move to make Dracula behave in this way. The all-powerful Prince of Darkness being forced to avoid conflict like this is an interesting dynamic, but it's hard to say these sections are anything interesting by themselves. I think most people will agree that anytime a non-stealth game tries to add a stealth segment, it's usually not that great. But in this case, they aren't bad. They're just kind of a weird addition that didn't really need to be there. And I would have rather, I don't know, actual puzzles like you did before. In fairness though, there is that cool bit that uses these big death dealers in a fun way. There's this big train sequence and it's a fight with Gabriel dealing with this demonic creature and these big guy with the guns, and it's a cool sequence where Gabriel's dodging gunfire, possessing bodies, getting shit done. It's cool. I like this. But you know what talking about this reminds me of? Remember how Lords of Shadow 1 and Mirror of Fate both had those neat little set piece moments that just gave some scenes a cool extra flair? Like Gabriel taking down a big guy, or Trevor latching onto a flying demon and diving off of a rooftop to keep kicking its ass. Well, Lords of Shadow 2 has basically none of that stuff. This train segment is about the hypest you get, and that's not great. We're playing as Dracula now. Why the hell doesn't he get some sick-ass fight scene? There's not really a grander point to be made here, really. I just don't get why we veered off in this direction. Like, guys, I know I compared Lords of Shadow to God of War a lot, and I really hated those moments where you had to climb a titan for 20 minutes, but Mirror of Fate handled this perfectly. I wanted a whole QTE where Dracula gets to body a whole gang of those guys with the guns he had to sneak past the entire game, especially because that would be a sick way to show off the return of the power that he had at the start of the game. You know, when he essentially blows up a continent from the looks of it.
In anima, nec incorpore!
Remember how Lords of Shadow 1 had that opening fight with the Warg and how it howls at the moon as the music swells up and creates this cinematic moment? None of that DNA is here at all, and it's really confusing. This is the vibe that you based 2 games of this trilogy on. The final game isn't the one that you decide to pull back on. If anything, it's when you double down and give us more. But that describes the basics of Lords of Shadow 2 pretty well. It does most of the things that the other 2 games do, but usually does them worse and has those distinct features play a much lesser part, to the point that it doesn't really feel like a Lords of Shadow game, while clearly still being one, which is good news to some, I'm sure, but that void isn't supplemented with anything. It's like they tried to course correct from the criticisms made about those first 2 games and didn't realize that you can't just change the recipe for the cake while it's in the fucking oven. Your chocolate cake can't become a fucking pepperoni pizza no matter how hard you wish it to be so. And all of the stuff that is in this game is to further the connection between this more personal journey, right? The stealth sections, the rat form, the lower stakes of the storyline, and the simplified presentation. This is a journey of the self, and a more introspective sort of adventure is to be expected. And I would absolutely love that. It's what Dirge of Cerberus is too, and I love it there. But the problem with it in Lords of Shadow 2 is that it results in a game that is bland, and none of it is much better than what the first game delivers. But with all that said, I appreciate the attempt here. I respect the choices that were made, and I find pulling these sorts of experiences apart very interesting regardless of how I feel by the end, because games are complex, and nothing is made to everyone's taste. Now let's talk about why I don't like the combat. Combat is an interesting aspect of Lords of Shadow 2 because there's some really cool stuff to talk about. It feels like Mercury Steam really had a look at what the first two games did with the combat and tried to think about what worked and what didn't, and that's resulted in arguably the best combat in this sub-series. If I think about what dragged the combat down before, it was repetition. You often did the same combos a bunch of times to the same enemies for hours on end before the game was over. Mirror of Fate was a much smaller game in scope, so the repetition was less noticeable, but still there if you looked hard enough. And this problem has not gone away at all, but it is a little bit better now than it was before. But let's start with the basics one last time. You've got direct attacks that go out in front of Gabriel and area attacks that go out around him, like always. These can be transitioned to an aerial launch at any time by pressing the jump button mid-combo, and from there you can initiate a full aerial combo. The hold input combos are still there with the slamming down combo, sustained whip attack, and everything that Gabriel had before, essentially. There's still that ability to seamlessly bridge combos together with loops like Guillotine, getting you back on the ground and into the next combo very easily. This is probably the smoothest the combat basics have felt across this whole trilogy, and I'm happy to see it. The defensive stuff is very similar too, with perfect blocks and dodges working in very similar ways. You can perfect block an enemy standard attack to get some easy damage in and work to fill in the focus meter much quicker, which makes a return here. When this meter is filled, enemies will drop orbs that you can suck up to fill the light and dark meters. The biggest change to how these basic systems feel lies mostly in the camera this time around, as that's what affects the core of your decision making. Like I said before, this game's camera is entirely controlled by you, and even though it does zoom out quite nicely, there's always the chance that enemies can be off camera, meaning that being aware of your surroundings is a pretty big part of staying alive, especially when some enemies can fire off projectiles when you aren't looking. What ends up happening then is that the combat changes gears subtly. As opposed to the super aggressive playstyles of the first two games, I often tried to slow things down a little bit and analyze what was going on around me. And that's when this combat sings, especially because you'll often get into fights with different enemy factions in the city. The demons and the soldiers fighting them off who are both trying to get to you. They'll usually attack each other, share their aggro with you and others, and accidentally help you out when you least expect it. It adds a nice chaotic aspect to the combat that fits right into this city that's in the middle of a demonic war. So these changes and additions to the formula are very welcome, but what about the bigger differences? Well, the main weapon this time is the Shadow Whip, which is made out of Gabriel's blood. We see him use this in Mirror of Fate 2, and looking back, that was a cool way to tease the moveset that he'd have in this game. He keeps the whip because he still intuitively knows it so well from his days with the Combat Cross, which makes sense. I know I wanted something different this time for variety's sake, but I think this explanation for keeping the whip makes a lot of sense and it's kinda cool. And thankfully, it is not the only weapon we have this time. The two magic modes have been completely overhauled this time around, and instead of just giving you access to new specials and passive bonuses, they come packaged as their own unique weapons. The light magic is now channeled through the Void Sword, and this refills your health as you strike enemies just like the light magic did. It's also an ice-themed weapon, so you've got some ice-related special moves to make use of. Void Sword attacks are quick and nice to look at, but tend to deal a little bit less damage overall. If the Shadow Whip's main draw is that it can attack multiple opponents at once, then the Void Sword is all about attacking singular foes and sapping as much health as you can. You do still get those AoE specials though, which look sick. Another nice thing is that these magic meters do not drain while the weapon is simply active. They only drain when you land attacks. The other weapon is the Chaos Claws, and these are big punchy gauntlets entirely designed to deal damage and pain. Their main utility lies in breaking enemy shields after landing a few punches, and this looks really cool. But they also just deal more damage than the basic attacks of other weapons. All three weapons come with their own skill trees too that let you unlock and upgrade a ton of different moves. There's also weapon mastery, but I mean, it's just, you use the moves a lot and they deal more damage eventually. That's all that really is. But having these three weapons opens up the variety of the combat system so much more, and being able to break the monotony of the same combos from the whip does help a lot. It's the best addition Lords of Shadow 2 makes, and I am very thankful for it. From a storytelling perspective, it's also the perfect way to combine the aspects of Gabriel's old self alongside the newer, rawer, angrier part of Dracula's power. Also, conjuring up a magical sword is always just cool. 9 times out of 10, it's just It's just sick. But while the attack options are better, the movement options haven't really been touched at all, and that's a shame. In Lords of Shadow and Mirror of Fate, it made sense that we didn't really have any movement options to make use of. Even in Alucard's case, it made sense since he was a newly made vampire and didn't know his capabilities yet. But even he got a glide and could do wall hopping, so, you know, there is that. But we're Dracula now, and I was hoping to see some sick-ass teleportation utilities, or maybe some other wacky movement-themed powers. Speed boosts, or leaps that can take you across a battlefield in seconds. Hell, what about some ways to slow time or something outside of the hourglass? Alucard's DLC gets this half right with him being able to teleport to places in the environment. Let me do this in combat, though. Bring me back to the teleportation wackiness of Virgil in DMC. Full disclosure, in case anyone gets mad at me, that is a super fan of this DLC. I did not finish this DLC, so I don't know if you can teleport in combat. All right, I'm not doing my due diligence. Sue me. We're at the end of this trilogy, and I couldn't do it. But ultimately, Lords of Shadow 2's real problem in the combat department is that you don't feel like you're playing as Dracula. You still feel like you're playing as Gabriel Belmont with a few flavor differences. And that's a problem, because for all of the improvements that have been made, there needed to have been a distinct shift away further from the combat identity of Lords of Shadow. You're still approaching nearly every situation in the same ways you did before. You don't feel the power that you're supposed to have, even as a weakened form of Dracula. And enemy attacks don't feel respectful of that either. It would have been sick if some enemies could use some kind of attack using light to attack Dracula's weaknesses. Or hell, maybe unleash some Belmont-style vampire hunters that I have to deal with who are genuine threats. Enemies you fight are either random demons that you can take care of in your sleep, or humans that just don't like you very much and so they try to kill you. These guys are definitely the tougher of the two, and they also call in mechs sometimes to take you out, but neither is all that much of a threat. Hey, I applaud the idea of calling in a mech, though. It's what I do. Sometimes, in order to make your role in an action game feel cooler, or at the very least more appropriate, you need to face things that make you feel special. Enemies that only you can defeat, with abilities that only you can pull off, which are things that Dracula should be facing. Give me some awesome Archangel enemies sent to cleanse the world and consequently kill Dracula. Or again, throw some vampire hunters my way and see how they fare. That could have been awesome to see. And amid all of this, we still have stuff that I have issues with. QTE grab attacks are once again back, but they're still not that great. It's cool that Dracula can now suck the blood from his enemies, and that refills a portion of his health bar, but they're still just not that fun to watch again and again, and once I got past the first 2 hours of the game, I never used them again. Make me button mash as I drain an enemy from all of his blood, and the longer I drain, the more health I get, all the while knowing that this is a risky move mid-combat because I will be vulnerable. There's an entire conversation to be held about QTEs and their place in action games, and really I can only think of one franchise that has used QTEs correctly, or at least to the point where I am most engaged in them. And we'll talk about that one day. And some genius, some fucking wise guy over at Mercury's team also decided it would be a good idea to give guns to some enemies, and I'm not happy about it. Guns in this game are they're just not right, because not only do they deal a lot of damage and can't reliably be avoided, enemies shooting at you don't seem to be interrupted by basic attacks, at least not in my experience. So if you had the correct idea of making your way into stop an enemy before they get a shot off, too bad, you're most likely getting blasted in the face. The real solution is using the Void Sword ranged shard thingies to freeze these guys before they can attack. But this relies on you having meter ready to go, and if you don't, then it's just not an option. This then feeds into a problem that's always been around, but never been a real issue until now, and that's that aerial combos are a little too good. Or maybe it's that staying on the ground with all these guns is just a horrendously bad idea. Most of the time, you're just better off launching an enemy, doing an aerial combo, guillotine, and then sending them back up for dessert all the time. Unless you're fighting the odd enemy that has an anti-air, then you just need to kill them first and then go back to doing what you were doing before. Look, action games usually have those moves that you can spam and get away with. Devil May Cry has Stinger and Helmbreaker. Ninja Gaiden has the Azuna Drop and the Flying Swallow. But both of those games incentivize you to actually very your moveset via style points or higher difficulty, forcing you out of your comfort zone and using the full scope of your moveset. All three of these games have had me ultimately approach these enemies in the exact same way time and time again, and it's disappointing. God of War solved this issue by changing up the combos from game to game slightly. You still had the trademark stuff there, sure, but the differences were there too. This series though? No, it's the same thing every game, and I'm sick of it. There's that glimpse of something more with the Void Sword and Chaos Claws, and that's great, but the enemy variety and situations don't demand anything more from you than you've already experienced at this point in the trilogy. And I played this game straight away on hard as well and had no problems whatsoever. Boss fights are at least the best they've been, probably. The first major one is against Satan's acolyte Racer Volkova, and it's a cool fight with fun patterns to learn. Carmilla makes a return with a fun fight as well, but there you have to break through her shield with the Chaos Claws while juggling adds, and it's kinda simple. The coolest boss fight probably goes to Victor Belmont though, the last of the Belmont bloodline. He uses a ton of the abilities from Lords of Shadow, and according to the in-game lore, most of these items are the exact same ones Gabriel used to use. Very cool to see the wings again, and this holy water too. Just wish he was maybe a little more aggressive in the fight. I really don't like being this way though, and frankly these days it takes a lot for me to get to this point. But I don't know, maybe I'm just so frustrated because I can really see the good in this game. Lords of Shadow 2 has good ideas, and I don't think that's deniable. The execution of those ideas is what's questionable, even though some of them are worthwhile. Adding the Void Sword and Chaos Claws was genius, and exactly what I needed from this system. Giving me a ton of cool abilities to unlock and work towards is also very nice, but this stuff is actively held back by repetitive enemy design. Some awkward choices that make certain abilities like breaking shields and guard more annoying than anything, and you simply don't get that feeling that you're playing as Dracula, which is honestly the biggest detriment, I would say. But what about the storyline? That's really what I'm here for now. I know I'm not going to get the action experience I quite want, but after Lords of Shadow and Mirror of Fate, I am deeply interested to see where this story goes. I think it is fair to say that a lot of this game's aspects were sacrificed for the sake of enriching the story and themes. So much of this experience is built in service to creating an introspective character study, and that's an amazing idea on paper, and has worked in the past for games that have done exactly this, though in my mind that sort of thinking is more in line with an abstract experience, like Silent Hill or maybe even Max Payne, where metaphors and thematic representations are real tangible things in their worlds that you can interact with. Taking those ideas and translating them into a Castlevania game sounds like an awesome idea to me, and that's what I was expecting as soon as I booted up Lords of Shadow 2. We're bringing back some things from the first game immediately, like the big book story framing device for the menus, but instead of some unseeable force controlling the book's destiny, it's in the hands of Gabriel himself. He's the one holding the weight of the narrative in his hands and flipping each page, literally making this a more personal journey right from the offset, and immediately cluing the player into the fact that above all else, this story is about Gabriel, a move that distinctly differentiates Lords of Shadow 2 from the previous two games in many ways. Lords of Shadow and Mirror of Fate are both ruminations on fate and betrayal and how we sometimes have no control over where our destinies lie, with both games framing their adventures through a book of destined history and the depths of darkness, both directly impersonal framing devices, but here Lords of Shadow 2 is showing us Dracula, here and now ready to tell his story. And this isn't a thing that the game starts and immediately drops the ball on. Lords of Shadow 2 is an intimate character study of Gabriel Belmont and Dracula as one being. What an existence like that does to someone who so fiercely fought against the creatures he would become. How multiple lifetimes can twist and distort even his own view of himself. We see someone in this game who is detached from himself, dissociative from his lived experiences, and a shell of the man we saw at the end of Lords of Shadow's DLC, who was angry, bitter, and full of hatred, to the vampire we saw in Mirror of Fate, who feels justified in warring with humanity and God himself, to this, someone that feels weak, meek, and pretty powerless. None of this is to say that this game is a path of redemption for Gabriel. Lords of Shadow 2 doesn't really waste much time in saying that there's a way back for Dracula. The closest we get to that is a moment with Marie telling Gabriel that there is more to him than this, with Gabriel then shutting those ideas down. And it's a refreshing angle because I think it'd be pretty hard to erratically redeem Gabriel after centuries of him being Dracula. Instead, I think it's far more interesting to poke around in the feelings that he has after all this time and discover if his heart truly is full of darkness or if there's something else occupying that space too. A big theme for Lords of Shadow 2 is regret. Regret for the choices made and the life you've lived. The things that you've done to others and what others have done for you. And from that urge to do better, to right the wrongs of the past and find some way forward that doesn't involve burning down those bridges again, to try and fight for something bigger than yourself. We see all of this through Gabriel's relationship with Trevor in Castlevania. His mind seems to be projecting this younger version of Trevor that Gabriel never met, but out of this we see Gabriel's urge to protect his son from his own nightmare, from the place that he has called home for centuries. We see a conscious push away from the Dracula persona and back to one of fatherhood and protection. And it's really so nice to see Gabriel have these moments, to go on a fetch quest for the son he never really knew. It means so much more when we go back and remember Gabriel's reaction to Trevor's death at his own hands in Mirror of Fate. That sharp turn from being this evil villain to a heartbroken father in mere seconds. That moment echoes throughout Lords of Shadow 2 passively, as it's arguably one of his most monstrous moments, second only to, killing a lot more people. All of this stuff is absolute gold, though. Taking Gabriel's character arc in this direction is exactly what I wanted from the first game, and it's doing everything I could have wanted here. But this is all at the cost of the main plot, because the journey to defeat Satan's acolytes is ultimately a really weak one that has next to no intrigue or even cool moments to talk about. If Castlevania represents the internal struggles that Gabriel has to overcome, then the rest of the game should be tests of the physical, a war that Gabriel struggles to upend and fights with gnashed teeth to get the job done. In contrast to the deep emotional journey, I think the real world one should have been one where he gets the shit kicked out of him, where he does not stop, he gets back up, he gets the job done, kills all the acolytes, and deals with Satan himself. Because deep down, out of the two of them, Gabriel knows that he has become the bigger monster. Instead, we've got a very bland A-plot that doesn't really do any of this. Gabriel basically has no troubles in this part of the story and goes from level to level, just started doing things before Zobek tells him where to go and what to do next. Dracula has barely any agency in this part of the storyline, and it's so strange. And there were plenty of times where I thought we would see things change, mainly when Victor Belmont gets introduced to the story, the very last in the line of Belmonts, and someone that eventually works with Dracula to help draw out an acolyte. But Victor's only in this game for about 20 minutes before being sacrificed to find an acolyte that happens to be in the giant building just here on the left. And Gabriel just lets Victor sacrifice himself. And that's the end of the Belmont bloodline right there. No more, bud. That's your main line of descendants done and dusted. And it's so hard for me to be fully on board with this game's themes of regret and family when you just let your grand times 16 grandson die just like that. There had to be some other way, or maybe I don't know, shove him out the way from being stabbed at the very last second or something. I get that we're trying to be sneaky and avoid Satan of being aware of our presence, but this is near the end of the game anyway. You say fuck it and announce your presence, bringing Victor alongside you to put an end to all of this. But nope, that doesn't happen. The other big problem I have with this plot is actually with Marie. She appears about halfway through the game in Castlevania, and I assumed it was just for this short scene with Gabriel, since she's like this painful memory for him. I like this idea. This is all fine and good, but part of the point of Marie is that she died and went to heaven, and Gabriel could never see her again, which caused him to go down this path of darkness in the first place. So if she's going to be in this game, be sure not to overuse her, because that will defeat the entire point, won't it? Well, then she's a part of a boss fight with Carmilla, where you can drain Marie's blood to restore your own for some reason. It just feels a bit insensitive, doesn't it? Gabriel, you can't be sucking the blood out of the wife that you killed. Then she shows up a few more times, and you know what? Fine. I guess. If Trevor is here like this, then I guess it makes sense. But then, in Alucard's Revelations DLC, she appears before Alucard in the real world? The rules surrounding Marie, they make no sense at this point, and it does not sit right with me that she's here like this, especially when the main game makes it out like all of this stuff is a dream for Gabriel. It's like he goes to a mental palace. Like it's a dream world. Why is she... What's happening? But then Alucard is able to hop in himself and start digging around too, and it makes no sense. It makes no sense. I also really don't need anybody to actually me here, because I'm sure there are explanations for this, but the storyline didn't give them to me. And that's my main issue. I don't know what's happening, and it feels like the game doesn't know either. Oh yeah, we should touch on Alucard too. Now Alucard was revealed all the way back in this game's CG trailer right at the end, because for some reason they made a CG trailer based on the intro to this game. But oh well. Now in this trailer, Alucard raises his sword and it's like, ooh, are they gonna fight? But in the game, that doesn't happen that way. They have a somewhat awkward stare down before the game cuts to old saggy Dracula. Ooh. This is obviously a bit of a cheeky revelation to be had later on, but Alucard does not rear his head for most of the game. Instead, we've got this guy here called the Lieutenant. And if it wasn't for the fact of Alucard holding a fucking sword in this intro, it'd be pretty hard to guess that this guy is Alucard, but yeah, it is. That's the big twist. Now, I don't hate this twist. This is a cool idea in itself, but yeah, it's hard not to figure it out early, really, isn't it? See, back in the past, Dracula and Alucard hatch a little scheme to deal with Zobek and Satan's acolytes in one fell swoop. To do this, Alucard had to shank Dracula with the Chrysagrum, which would put Dracula in a deep sleep for a long while and drain his powers. But this had to be done to draw everyone out into the open, and this plan does actually work. Kind of a cool scheme from Alucard here, really. I wouldn't say it necessarily meshes well with the storyline that goes on in Dracula's in a Castlevania, though. I would have expected a big scene of Dracula apologizing to his son and owning his mistakes in the real world, with Alucard maybe showing off some emotion too, but both guys just kind of get on with what they're here to do. So yeah. Frankly, it's bizarre to see how much of this game is devoted to being this deeply emotional, rich storyline, and then you have the rest of the game saying, fuck it, we don't need all that shit. Either way, this whole story culminates in a final battle against Satan, with Dracula and Alucard standing tall. This is the fight that this whole trilogy has built up to, and it's frankly a really boring one, but we're gonna go with it. And after a big set PC moment, which is again pretty rare for this game, the final battle commences, and it's with Satan possessing Alucard's body. So we don't even get to really fight Satan this time. That seems dumb. Now I know what some of you guys are waiting for. Is this fight a traffic light fight? Well, I'm glad to announce that this is not a traffic light fight. There's nothing like that at all. This is just a honest brawl, and I love that. Well, the fight itself isn't that great, really. It's full of unblockables, annoying dodge timings, and they only recorded like 5 lines for the fight that Satan says 12 times over each time. So it could have been better, but hey, it's the best we've had out of all 3 games, probably, in terms of final bosses. So yeah, I guess I win. But yeah, Dracula wins and Satan is dead, I guess. They don't really answer it because we defeated him before and he just came back. So why is it any more final this time? I guess in Lords of Shadow 1, that was a shadow figment of Satan. Is this meant to be the real deal? Maybe? I don't know. They don't really explain it, so it doesn't really matter, I guess. Gabriel wakes Alucard up with his blood and destroys the Mirror of Fate, because he has that now, by the way, before doing the whole who knows what fate has in store shtick, and he goes back into his chapel before the morning light arrives. And this is how the trilogy ends. No. What kind of ending is that? Nothing happens. We just win the day and go home. This is like a Call of Duty ending, and even some of those have an interesting twist to pull at the end when you least expect it. There is nothing here that really lingers on any sort of feelings like the first 2 games did. Lords of Shadow, a feeling of emptiness as you realize the journey was cursed from the start and evil led you astray. Mirror of Fate, a family fractured and forever changed by circumstances out of their control. Lords of Shadow 2, I don't know, we won, I guess. Seriously, that's it. There is nothing to talk about with this this ending other than that. And after all the glazing I've done over these 3 games and their storylines, that is it. Disappointing isn't even the word. I don't know how to feel about this. We've got some seriously amazing stuff in this game. Things that I always wanted this series to do, like giving Gabriel more agency and dialogue in his own storyline, delving into the less obvious aspects of this character and making him fight for his family, and giving him the opportunity to learn and grow from the mistakes he's made throughout the series. And then to top off all of these themes, there isn't a moment to acknowledge that growth or a beat that puts his whole journey into perspective. We instead get a super cheesy line and absolutely nothing afterwards. Wow. So, where does this put Lords of Shadow as a trilogy in the pantheon of gaming history? How does it slot in there along with the entire Castlevania franchise? I don't know, man. I've tried to make a point throughout these videos that there is an equal amount of good and bad ideas throughout these 3 games. That for every questionable choice, there's a great one just around the corner that makes these titles worth experiencing. Even for those that are die-hard Castlevania fans or players that have never played one in their life, and I feel like that's still the case. These are games everyone should play at some point. There's just no rush to do that at all, really. But let's try and collect the best and worst parts of this trilogy here at the end to see what we've really got to work with. First up, the storyline. Now I know Lords of Shadow 2 sort of went to shit by the end, but that doesn't totally negate the quality of the storytelling elsewhere in the series. I remember saying that these games have had some of the best narrative moments out of the whole Castlevania franchise, and I still kind of stand by that for the most part. Warping the conventions of what's expected from Castlevania by having you play as Dracula is very cool. Having the first game in the series be a breakdown of the dark fantasy journey structure and ending it with Gabriel getting nothing that he wanted was a really dark and interesting way to go. And then to have Mirror of Fate essentially be a consequence of those events and showcase how it wasn't just Gabriel who'd be affected, that was all really good. I maintain the opinion that all of these ideas work well and were explored just fine, but I wish that every character had a little more to say. It would have been cool if Gabriel had way more stuff to say in Lords of Shadow to flesh out his character there a little more. And it would have been neat to see Trevor's training from the Brotherhood of Light in Mirror of Fate, or maybe even more of Simon's life after losing his mother in that game. That was a 3DS game again, so I understand the limitations at a certain point, but it would have been nice just to get a little bit more. I also loved the visual direction of all 3 of these games. I think the first is the prettiest though, by far. There are still shots from this game that have been burned into my mind, but Mirror of Fate and Lords of Shadow 2 also have plenty of cool places too. So yeah, visual treats all around for the most part. As for the combat, it is a mixed bag. I'm very particular when it comes to how combat systems should feel, but I'm also very happy to give systems a lot of leeway so I can see how they slot into the overall design. And Lords of Shadow, I think Mercury's team did a good job at adapting 3D Castlevania combat and mixing it with some God of War seasoning to get the meal that they served. The problems for me come into the fact that all 3 games feel so samey in the combat department, which is crazy considering that one of these games was in 2D. I really expected it to feel quite unique, and it didn't really. All the time in every game I've been doing the direct attack into aerial launcher combo into guillotine and repeat, and I understand how insanely difficult it is to upend things like this and put in new stuff. Game development is a nightmare, and it's amazing that we get the kind of games we do in this industry. I just wish we could have had a bit more variety. And Lords of Shadow 2 supplies that with the Void Sword and the Chaos Claws. In fairness, those really are the saving graces of this combat system because they add just enough flavor to keep things interesting. By far, the weakest elements of these games probably comes down to their level design. In particular, the way that they're structured to sort of encourage backtracking, but not really. They often just have some haphazardly thrown in HP or MP up item that you need a double jump to get some point later in the game. And that sort of thing doesn't really work for games that are mostly linear. Making them the only real incentive for going back is a bit of a bizarre choice when you could have made some light puzzles instead to make them acquirable then and there. Mirror of Fate is the only one that gets this sort of right, but that's a 2D Vania anyway, and I'd be shocked if it was screwed up there as well. But what exactly is it about these games that makes them so divisive? Well, I can't totally answer that because I mostly enjoyed what I played, I think. What I can personally say though is that there's really not that much about these games that is super compelling. Of course, it's hard to easily say what makes anything compelling, right? Usually it's a bunch of factors that contribute to eliciting a certain feeling, response, or emotion out of you. And for a lot of people, I'd wager that Lords of Shadow fails to elicit much of anything in any particular way. I don't think the story goes in hard enough to really pull you to care much without really really looking into it. The presentation of each game being this self-serious film-like time is hard to swallow too. Castlevania has always had a certain layer of whimsy, color, fun, and adventure about it, but it's hard to say that Lords of Shadow follows suit in that way. And at the end, that puts me in a bit of a weird spot because I don't really feel anything towards these games now. I rolled credits on Lords of Shadow 2 and felt nothing towards any of the characters at play, and I certainly didn't feel like it was fun enough to dive back in for any more. It's a frustratingly middling experience, and that's all I can really say about these games. They have good ideas, but fail to execute them all succinctly. The game feel was never 100% there, the story didn't amount to much by the end, and it's hard to say that it all felt like a Castlevania game to me. In the end, what does a Castlevania game mean to me? And I still don't really know the answer to that question, but what I do know is that I don't think these games have anything, really, that should be carried over into Castlevania's future. The DNA of these games need to stay far away from whatever Castlevania needs to be going forward. But hey, I'm glad I played these games, and thank God Mercury Steam went on to make Metroid Dread, because that game's fucking sick.